Thank you guys. This is such a fun time for me to be here, and I hope you are all as excited as I am. I'm very excited in particular because I was just thinking before this talk, when I was a wee young lad signing up for the CITP newsletter and receiving all these updates several years ago, and to be here now, being in the newsletter and giving a talk is just a tremendously phenomenal experience. And so if you've seen me today, you definitely have seen me smiling. I'm very excited about this talk. It is because I'm truly just very excited to be here sharing this with you guys. Today, we're going to be talking about deepfake pornography, as you see on the slides behind me. And as you may guess, there will be descriptions of image-based sexual violence and profanity, although I'll try to keep that to a minimum. There's not going to be any explicit imagery on the screen. And in general, I tried my best to keep this very high level, but nonetheless, this is the topic at hand. This is work that I did with Manuel, and this work was just submitted last month, so it's a little bit rough around the edges. I just finished the presentation recently. This is the first time that I'm giving it, so I would love to have feedback whenever you want. You can catch me in the hallways, of course, only positive feedback. If you have negative feedback, you can write it somewhere and send it to me in Slack maybe. But yeah, let's get started. So the overview for today's talk is that we'll be talking about this problem that reporters have called an epidemic of deepfake pornography. And I will give you the precise definition for this term in a little bit, but I just want to sketch out what the talk would look like today. There was a possible solution that came last year in the form of the Take It Down Act, which was a landmark bill criminalizing the non-consensual publication of intimate images. And this is what we'll be evaluating today. And most of the talk will really be talking about this natural experiment that we use to study the impact of the act on the dissemination and demand of deepfake pornography. So this is really like 3/4 of the talk. Now, as promised, I'll give you a little bit of a more precise definition of what I mean when I say deepfake pornography. So this is a subset of image-based sexual abuse. And there's this term that I really like its precision, but it's kind of a mouthful to say, which is synthetic non-consensual explicit imagery, SNCEI, which most people have just taken, to associate with deepfake porn or deepfake nudes. This is how it's mostly covered in popular media. This is maybe what you have heard, and it's the term that has been thrown around for several years at this point. Throughout this talk, when you hear me say deepfake pornography, because that's the term that you probably have a better association with, I really want you to be thinking as sort of substitute or synonym with this term SNCEI. And the type of stuff that we really care about in this study are synthetic images that have been fabricated particularly with software, and in particular in this case with AI, non-consensual, so images that have been created without the consent of the victims, and explicit imagery, meaning that they involve nudity or involve some sort of sexual act involved. So synthetic, non-consensual, explicit imagery is what you will mostly see on the screen. I will be using that interchangeably with deepfake pornography. Now, the reason why we're talking about this today is because, as you may all have heard or been made aware of, is that generative AI has significantly reduced the barriers to create SNCEI, or deepfake pornography. So, reporting by the New York Times, for example, finds that teen girls are confronting an epidemic of deepfake nudes in schools. So these are middle schoolers, high schoolers that are all of a sudden seeing fabricated, explicit images of them being circulated. And you have all probably heard that there's an emerging ecosystem of applications and websites that are facilitating this at very low cost, and even to users that are not very technically savvy. Furthermore, generative AI has made the quality in terms of photorealism of these images just all just so much more impressive than they were a few years ago. And so this has really ushered this epidemic of deepfake news. Now, I want to also emphasize that the deepfake pornography, study and study again find that they overwhelmingly impact women and girls, and so these are the primary victims of this type of abuse, and they have devastating consequences. So this has tremendous mental health effects. It leads to a tremendous amount of depression, anxiety, PTSD. You are all of a sudden facing your social reputation and your social connections, seeing you or seeing these images that we're creating without your consent circulating on the internet. So it's an overall just tremendously traumatic experience, and it's just happening more and more often. Now, against this backdrop comes this Take It Down Act that passed Congress last year on April 28, 2025. And this is a landmark bill because prior to this, for 10 years plus, there was no single federal level bill that really helped tackle this type of abuse. Instead, we had a patchwork of state level legislations that people could try to rely on to do something about this. Now, I'm very aware that the Take It Down Act has faced also a lot of criticism and has some potential for abuse. That's, conversation for another day, but I think it's still remarkable the fact that we finally get this federal bill that's passed here in the US. Now, today we'll be mainly talking about this non-consensual publication of intimate images. It is important to note that the Take It Down part of the Take It Down Act is about this notice and removal process that platforms should implement, and this platforms have until May 2026 to implement this process. Some platforms have already done so, as we'll see later, but in today's talk, we'll mainly be talking about this non-consensual publication part, which has already been criminalized. Now, ideally, what we would expect or we would want to happen is that this criminalization would reduce the flow of deepfake pornography across the internet. So in a very idyllic world, you have this Take It Down Act, you'd see the flow go down, and we would all be happy. Now, you might be trying to think, well, how does this come to be, right? Like, what are the mechanisms through which this bill could have indeed this impact? And one of the ways would be that the people who create or share this type of content would all of a sudden fear criminal liability. So you have less contributors of this material, and therefore you have less flow of this type of content on the internet. Pretty straightforward. Another mechanism by which this could happen is that the criminalization may lead to websites shutting down because all of a sudden they are afraid of the criminal repercussion. Or potentially the infrastructure providers that support these websites may not want to be associated with this criminal entity, and they rescind services from these websites, leading them to shutting down. And so this would be another way, for example, in which this flow of deepfake pornography would go down over time. This seems to be the case for what happened last year, right? So a week after the Take It Down Act passed Congress, and it was imminent that it was going to be enacted, this very infamous website called MrDeepfakes that at this point had been operating for about 7 or 8 years, shut down. Now there's other speculations of what led to the website shutting down, whether, again, it was the infrastructure providers or this expose on the creator and so on. But it also, is very coincidental that, we have this bill and a week later, this website shuts down. What did this website look like? Just for, people may have read academic papers. There's this very famous Stanford paper on characterizing this website. There's another paper on the early days of MrDeepfakes. But if you have not had the chance to read this, this is what the MrDeepfakes forum looked like. So it has this traditional forum type of template that you can see on the screen. And this was taken just a few months before the website shut down. MrDeepfakes also had a main page where they had this sort of traditional tube site view where you could see all the videos, you could browse images and so on, similar to a traditional pornographic website. But there was also this forum component, which was very important. And as you can see in the bottom right, this forum at this stage had almost 9,000 threads, almost 50K messages, and over 650,000 members. So people would come here to both, share images, videos, ask for the creation of other type of images and videos, pay for those, and also share tutorials, tools, and so on. Now, this is the dissemination aspect. These are communities where people come and share things, and we'll be mainly talking about this dissemination. It is also important to emphasize the production, which we'll not be really talking about in this talk too much, but I wanted to nod to that. So the production would be these websites that facilitate the creation, so notification type of websites or any sort of websites that let you create videos of people using reference material and so on. This has very well been covered by Gibson et al. in 2025. You can take a look for that if you're interested in the production aspect. Today, we're going to be talking about this dissemination portion. And as I gave you a sense of what MrDeepfakes looks like, but there's other communities online where people congregate to share this type of content. So, for example, 4chan is one of them. 4chan is an anonymous image board, which operates kind of like a forum with various subforums in it. So you have all these subforums of different types of interests, and a set of these are for sexually explicit material. We'll be looking at one specific subforum that seems to abound with this type of material, and then we'll also be looking at website A and website B. Now, the reason why I'm using these monikers for website A and website B is because these are two websites that share a lot of this content, but have not really been studied by academics, and they're not really very known. They're very active for the people that are in these communities, but they're not perhaps that publicly known. And we didn't feel comfortable drawing attention to them. We didn't feel comfortable drawing traffic to them. We didn't think that was the right thing. So I'm going to be talking about them in a de-identified manner as website A and website B. 4chan has been around for a long while, and it has been subject to many academic studies. So we decided to go ahead and make that one public. Now, the way that we chose website A and website B is because they have a variety of characteristics that make them important for, or make them useful for our study. So these are just two small screenshots of part of each of these websites. As you can see, website A, for example, is a very similar format as MrDeepfakes forum. It's very big. It has over 2.7 million members. It has over 6 million posts and almost 271,000 threads. So very substantial, but it's a general, it's a forum that involves a lot of different type of pornographic material, not just deepfake pornography, but they do have a subforum dedicated to that type of content. And we have website B that also has all these different subforums where each post is called a gallery, and it's primarily an image-based website, where you can see at the top they have this AI-generated pornography subforum. Now, these two websites, the reason they're very useful is not only because they are very big communities, as you can see, much bigger than the MrDeepfakes subforum, but they are also have time-stamped posts and contributors associated to each of those posts, which would allow us to do a lot of the analysis that we want to do today. So far, so good. Everybody can see clearly everything? Great. Now, ideally, what we would want to happen in this type of study that we have is that we would like to look at each of these subforums, and we would like to see that this bill or this shutdown came into effect and that the activity in the subforum of interest would go down. So you have, let's say, the total activity across the website, keeps going up because people are still posting in subforum 1, subforum 2, and so on. But we would want, ideally, to see that the subforum dedicated to deepfake pornography to go down in activity over time. Now, we need a technique that would let us, disentangle this, and we need a technique that also lets us work with the fact that we have very noisy time series and not this very straight lines that indicate clear trends. And so this is, for example, what activity looks like for one of these websites. As you can see, it's very messy. There's a lot of things going on, and we need something that helps us disentangle this. Now, luckily for us, there is such a technique, and it's called a synthetic control design. So this is a quasi-experimental method that lets us, set up this nice natural experiment. And the key intuition for a synthetic control is that when you have one or a small set of treated units that you care about, and that you have this, well-defined intervention that should only affect that treated unit of interest and should not affect the other units, you can employ this technique. And for precision here, what we are trying to do is to create this synthetic control using all those time series from all these other subforums that should not be affected by the intervention, and find a convex combination of all these non-treated units. That gives us this synthetic control, and that gives us something called a counterfactual. So then we can look at what happens to this counterfactual and what happens to the treated unit, and derive some conclusions based on that. The two main things that need to be in place for us to apply this design is that the pre-intervention fit should be good. So we want our synthetic control to resemble or behave in the same way as the treated unit's trajectory, and the control units should not be affected by the intervention. Afterwards, once we have our counterfactual, we can see what happened to our treated unit time series. If the divergence is up, that's a positive effect. If the divergence is down, that's a negative effect. And if they keep looking like each other, no effect. So far, so good. I think I'm seeing some nodding heads. Great. We also care about the average gap of the divergence. So if we have this, divergence between our treated unit and the synthetic control, then we can see what the gap is between these two and get a sense of how big the magnitude is between the treated unit and its counterfactual. Very straightforward. And then lastly, we care about the error ratio pre and post intervention. So this error ratio is essentially you find the error in the fit of your treated unit and its synthetic control before the intervention, you find it after the intervention, you take the ratio of these two, and this gives you a sense of how meaningful or how important that divergence is based on the fit that you have. So you want low root mean square prediction error before, and to observe an effect, you would want to see a high root mean square prediction error. So these are the things that we'll be mainly talking about as you get to see the actual results. Now, in summary, we have these three websites. We have these treated units that are subforums where SNCEI type of content is present. All the other subforums where this is not the content that exists there are the control units. And for website A and website B, we can measure the new posts and the new contributors on a weekly basis because those are time-stamped and we have the contributor information. For 4chan, because it's an anonymous image board, we cannot do this, so we can only look at the number of new posts. The study period that we looked at is 1 year in total, 29 weeks pre-intervention, 23 weeks post-intervention. And you might be wondering, why did we pick this subforum called requests on 4chan? And the reason is because when we analyzed this subforum, we found that about 86% of all the requests in the subforum were for deepfake pornography, assistance in generating them, or tools or help from other people. People would come, provide an image, and ask for help in some sort of deepfake pornography type of service. So that's why this subforum is relevant. You can also think of the 4chan website in this case as a proxy for demand because people are requesting this type of content. Now, let's start with that and what the synthetic control results look for 4chan. So, as you can see, the yes, Marianne.
What's the number of control units you have in the previous slide?
Yeah, the number of control units are, in the case of 4chan, all the sexually explicit subforums that would not be affected by the intervention. So this would be, for example, adult cartoons or adult torrents. I'm trying to pick, the more kosher ones, right? But these are, and so it's the same case for website A, website B. It will be all the other subforums that are not oriented on content about deepfake pornography.
So you're trying to come up with similar ones before.
Yeah,
that's the idea.
They would have the same trajectory, but different content.
Okay.
And we would hope that after the intervention, maybe there would be a divergence in the trajectory. So, as you can see here, before the intervention, the treated unit and its synthetic control kind of resemble each other. After the intervention, and around June 16th, there is this divergence where the treated unit shoots upward and the synthetic control has a bit more of a measured, continued increase. Now, this gray line that you see behind me is data censoring because 4chan was hacked 2 weeks leading to the Take It Down Act, so it was offline, and so we don't have data for that because there was no activity, and so you can see that all the subforums were sort of essentially going back to their normal behavior before this divergence takes place. For this subforum, we estimated that there were about 29,000 new threads requesting this type of content. Now let's look at website B. For website B, we have new contributors on the left, new posts on the right. You can see that new contributors, for example, this is an example of a pre-intervention fit that is not too great, probably because there's not as many new unique contributors on a weekly basis. So the interpretation is a little bit more shaky for that. But for the new posts, we can see that the contributors that are there, the activity between the treated unit and its synthetic control very closely resembles each other leading up to the intervention. There's a small decrease, and then the treated unit shoots upwards again for the rest of the summer. So there's this clear divergence after the intervention takes place. For context, more than 35,000 posts were added to this subforum during the study period. And then lastly, we have website A. On website A, we do have more contributors than on website B, and we have this very similar pattern in both new contributors and new posts, where we have a treated unit and synthetic control that resemble each other leading into the intervention and then continues to rise after the intervention. Now, as you might see here in this case, there seems to be a break from the trend right around March 24th or a little bit before that. Can everybody see that? What I'm saying makes sense? Okay, great. So there's a little bit of this break pre-intervention that I'll tell you a little bit more about before. But before I even continue, I'm curious. Has anybody used synthetic controls here before? Okay, great. Because if you had, you would raise your hand and ask me, Alejandro, does that mean there is an anticipation effect? And what should we do about that? And so, because nobody has done this, I would very clearly omit that and not tell you anything. I'm kidding. I will still tell you, but a few slides down the road. What happens in the synthetic control when you have a break from the trend prior to the intervention? Now, before we move further, I just wanted to contextualize a little bit these results, right? Like, we've been talking about new contributors and new posts, but a post is not necessarily one image or one video, especially in the case of website A and website B. On website A, one post averaged about either 10 images or videos or URLs. So you can think of whatever number of posts I showed you before, 49,000 plus, multiplied by 10. And this is also considering that there are external URLs to data repositories that have gigabytes or hundreds of gigabytes of content. So this is a lot. On website B, which is a primarily image-based type of subforum, each post averaged 62 images. So you take those 35,000 plus posts, and you multiply that by 62 to get a sense of how many images were posted on that website during that period of time. And on website A, we have this useful metric of views on some of the threads. And we can see that on website A, one celebrity's thread had only 437 contributors, but 7 million views. So we're talking here about contributors that are in the order of tens or hundreds, but when you think of consumers, this is a much, much, much lower bound of the amount of people that are also consuming this content. So this is just to contextualize a little bit and give you a bit more of a sense of the magnitude of the problem that we're dealing with. Now, another thing that people may have not asked me because they have not used synthetic controls, but I'm going to give you away for free, is how do we ensure that our results are robust? And one of the things that we can do in this setup is that we can do something called a placebo test. And essentially what we do is we grab each control unit and we consider it to be treated, and we rerun the synthetic control. And what this gives us is essentially a sense of how meaningful is the effect that we're observing, or how much is it due to chance, right? Like if we were just grab another subforum, make it the treated unit, would we also see sort of this shooting effect, right? Like after the intervention. And as you can see, I'm going to show you just the example for website A for now, but you can see that the black line here is the trajectory of the synthetic control for the treated unit fakes AI deepfakes, minus its synthetic control, just to center it on 0, as you can see at the bottom. And all these other gray lines are the trajectory as if other subforums were considered the treated unit. That's a bit of a mouthful, but am I getting some nods that this still makes sense? Okay, great. And then the beautiful thing with this is that we can also grab all these post and pre-error ratios that I told you about before and plot a distribution of those errors, and we get a sense of how meaningful this, we have good pre-treatment fit, we have a big divergence afterwards, and it turns out that for this subform, for example, that error was the highest when you compare it to other control units as potential treated units. And for all the previous plots that I showed you, this is the result that we get, essentially. So the error ratio is the highest. So this gives us some credibility that, indeed the effect that we're observing is very strong for that specific subforum. Great. Now, across all these deepfake pornography subforums, we can see that there was an increase in the volume of posts and contributors. Now, I'm showing mainly here posts again to not, put 6 plots on the screen and have you, look at all of those at once, but you kind of saw this pattern across the board. And what I want to pause here and just also mention is that it's very tempting to look at this and say, intervention came, there was an increase. But this is not really the takeaway that I want you to have, is that intervention came, some other websites or some other parts of the internet, such as the MrDeepfakes website, were affected. And what you're observing here is activity increase in these websites, meaning that potentially people relocated to these websites. So this rise in trend lines is activity coming to these platforms. It's not necessarily these platforms creating more content or saying, okay, the bill came through, we're going to crank out more of this stuff. Is activity relocating to this place, and we see that there was an increase across these 3 websites. Now, as I mentioned before, right, or as you can see, the timing is a little bit different, right? Like for website B and 4chan, we see this sort of break in trend right around June 16th, and we do see sort of like this increase around June 16th also for website A, but in reality for website A, this break in trend first occurs earlier, and this merits a bit more investigation. Now, I've mostly been talking about the Take It Down Act, and this has been the very US-centered legislative analysis, but the reality is that these websites do not live in isolation, and they're not primarily consumed by US people, and are not just primarily governed by US laws. There's other things also at play, and there are other regulatory pressures taking place around this time. And the main one, the main legislator that was very active early 2025 as well, was the UK. And the UK had something called the Online Safety Act that was passed around 2023, but its enforcement began on March 2025, March 16th or so. And as part of their enforcement, Ofcom, which is the communications regulator of UK, starting assessing which websites, had some sort of duties and requirements that they had to fulfill, and started sending letters of inquiry to these websites. So the Online Safety Act involves a lot of things. It involves age verification. It involves different type of compliance related to child safety and so on. So this is just one component of the Online Safety Act, which is this illegal content risk assessment, under which deepfake pornography falls under. But this is sort of another thing that we had to be mindful of that was taking place early in 2025. And one of the nice things about the synthetic control design is that if you observe an anticipation effect, you can backdate your intervention. Of course, having some sort of theoretical grounds to do so, but it's entirely a normal and regular and advisable thing to do. So for example, for website A, we can rerun a synthetic control, taking the UK's OSA enforcement as the onset of, or as the intervention date. And as you can see, this more closely resembles this potential break-in trend that we saw before. I'll tell you a little bit about what this means for a causal interpretation in a second, but this is a robustness check that is advisable to do when you observe some sort of anticipation effect. The pattern, as you can see, stays essentially the same. Now, a big question also is, are these websites aware of legislation, right? Like, are they aware of the legislative climate, and can we find hints of the fact that they indeed adapt and change their policies accordingly? And we tried to dig in a little bit for each of these websites, and we found at least, for example, this might be too small, but 4chan updated their legal page last year on their stance on the take it down policy, and so they have implemented already this notice and removal procedure. So if you have some sort of content that you want removed from 4chan, there's this page where you can refer to have that content taken down. And on website B, the administrator has this administrator-only subforum where they post announcements, updates, and so on. And so on September 11th, 2025, we see that they are discussing the age registration nonsense. This refers to the UK's OSA, asking websites to have age verification checks. And we see that website B also maintains a list of celebrities who gets periodically updated, seemingly from legal pressure from their legal teams. And so, for example, on October 15th, they said Taylor Swift, no more her. You cannot post things about Taylor Swift. And there's a few other celebrities whom you cannot post on this website. But, it doesn't mean necessarily that they are super compliant, but they're selectively compliant, and these are some hints that we have of their awareness of this type of legislation. For website A, we did not find such a thing. Now, are users aware of legislation? And across all three websites, you can find posts and conversations leading up to and after these bills took place, and especially, for instance, for the Take It Down Act. On website A, it might be a little bit too small, but this person is saying, hey, there's been a lot of development lately. For example, enforcement of the Take It Down Act kicks in May 2026. It may be a federal crime up to 2 years to not only post or reshare leaks, including deepfakes. Platforms will also be held accountable, and so on and so forth. And this is even if they're not based in the US. So on website B, somebody starts a thread asking, does this just affect us? Does it affect specifically people in the US? And unfortunately, there was also this very popular thread with hundreds of replies when President Trump signed the Take It Down Act, wondering if this had any sort of effect or was it going to change anything. Now, this does not mean that everybody is aware, but you can see that some users are definitely aware and are trying to figure out how to make sense of this and what's going to change in response. And what I really like about these excerpts is that they potentially give us hints about why the act ultimately perhaps did not have its desired effect. Why ultimately, the activity continued to grow undeterred. And so, for example, just looking at these three examples, you can say that people may not understand how the law works, right? This person thinks that the Take It Down Act comes into play in May 2026, when in reality, it's already a federal crime to do what they are saying it's not a crime. People may be unclear whether it affects them. Maybe they think, okay, this just affects me if I'm in the US, not if I'm, external to the US. And some people just may not see it also as a problem, right? So a lot of the discourse on that 4chan thread was people saying, this doesn't matter, this won't change anything, or you have this person saying, well, for random women, this is kind of wrong, but celebs, I don't know, I think deepfakes is good, right? And so, there might be some certain sense of moral ambiguity where this type of stuff is right for certain victims, but not others, and perhaps people think that, well, if I'm just doing this of celebrities, this might be okay. And this may help explain or give us some hints of why perhaps the activity continued as usual. Now, to put everything together and say a little bit more about sort of this causal interpretation, let's take a sort of a step back and look at this again. Essentially, what we saw happen last year is that there was mounting regulatory pressure, primarily from the US and the UK, right? The Take It Down Act passes the Senate February 14th. President Trump indicates somewhere early that year that if that bill passes the House, he would sign it. March 16th, UK OSA enforcement begins. Some platforms are impacted and some take action, right? So 4chan is contacted by UK's Ofcom on April 12th. They receive a letter, so they're definitely aware of it. The MrDeepfakes website shuts down. The Take It Down Act passes Congress, becomes imminent. But ultimately what we see is that activity seems to relocate to platforms willing to endure or fight legislative pressure. So on August 27th, 4chan launches a legal case against Ofcom, saying that they are overreaching and that they have no legal case against them in US soil. So this is an ongoing legal battle. Ofcom also launched an investigation against website B on September 11th. But ultimately, throughout this whole period, the flow of deepfake pornography continued undeterred. MrDeepfakes website shut down, and this just went seemingly elsewhere. And this also echoes the origins of the MrDeepfakes website itself. In fact, before MrDeepfakes came to be, there used to be a subreddit called Deepfakes, which, after it got taken down from Reddit, 2 weeks afterwards, the MrDeepfakes website was launched. So it seems that overall, what we observed through the setup is that the same took place in 2025. Now, lastly, the neat thing about all of this is that this synthetic control setup is pretty neat because it let us study the impact of this policy on the activity on this ecosystem. But there's other things in the horizon that we can potentially study, and we are kind of in the middle of it all. And we're able to study the impact of these future bills and these future developments. So for example, the Defiance Act, which entitles remedies to victims of non-consensual intimate image abuse, just passed the Senate on January 13th, 2026, and may be enacted in the future. We don't know when. We'll see if it passes the House. The UK's Ofcom determined on February 12th, just a few days ago, that website B is non-compliant and they may be subject to some sort of penalties. So we can potentially see if this ends up doing anything to website B. And ultimately, the Take It Down Act notice on removal comes into effect in May 2026, which again, we can keep using this setup to see if any of these things ultimately have the impact that we expect them to have. Phenomenal. So, to wrap it all up, we presented an approach to measure the impact of policies targeting deepfake pornography. I hope that you enjoyed that explanation of synthetic controls and that you found it a useful tool that you may have in your toolkit in the future. We saw that these laws against deepfake pornography redistributed activity across websites, likely to those that resist legal enforcement and perhaps places that users see as future safe havens. However, it is unclear how users choose which platforms they migrate to. So future work may try to get a sense of why users pick the platforms that they pick and the timing of these decisions. That might be useful. Seems like platforms are aware of legislation and that many users are also aware as well, but there might be some uncertainty around it. But ultimately, even though we find that these laws seemingly were so far ineffective, it is unclear what made them ineffective. So this would also be a useful thing to study in the future. Now, that's it for what I have, and I would love to hear your questions, thoughts, and feedback. Thank you. Yes.
So super interesting talk. I guess I'm curious, you kind of framed this as like a substitution effect, right? Do you have a sense of what share of potential posts from MrDeepfakes ended up going into these 3 websites? Whether it's post or user, I mean, I realize you can't exactly one-to-one match it, but is it like 100% substitution?
Yeah, that's a great question. We would have loved to know this as well. I think it's primarily substitution, but I think at some point in the statistics that we see, it also surpassed. So, you know, as we see on website B, or even just website A had more posts in 1 year than all of MrDeepfakes had in 8 years. So in a way, I think there's perhaps some substitution, but I think there's just a tremendous increase because that's a forum also is just bigger than MrDeepfakes if you extend it beyond the study period. Yes.
Thank you. This was super interesting. I'm curious, kind of more conceptually, thinking about the substitution effects and about platform sizes, whether it might be possible that people are leaving popular platforms and then going to more obscure platforms, and so maybe the content is still there but less eyes are on it. Do you think that could be the case? Or?
Yeah, I think the fact that they are perhaps going to more fringe platforms is interesting, and we thought about it in these terms as well. But I'm not sure if that is entirely true, just given the fact that 4chan receives millions of unique visitors every month. And this website A was several orders of magnitude bigger than MrDeepfakes. It's had over 2.5 million registered members, a lot more presumably non-registered. And website A actually has been active since 2006 and has tens of millions of galleries. So I think that all of these communities are just also substantially larger. They're a little bit, perhaps, not as visible because academic studies have not shed a light on them, but they have sizable communities.
Still pretty popular.
Yeah, they're still pretty big. Yeah, Francesco. Oh, sorry.
This echoes a bit the previous question, but also the point that you were making at the end that like we're in the middle of all of this, and it would be interesting to study like future effects of this. This echoes also a bit the history of how MrDeepfakes came to be. And like what I was wondering is, I assume there's not only website A and website B, but also website C, D, E, F, G, etc. So, like, how do you think about, as people probably tend to move towards like fringer platforms and like more obscure parts of the internet? Like, do we still have a way to assess and address the impacts of these interventions? And maybe also from like a broader policy perspective, I know you're not a legal scholar, but based on your experience, is there a path forward that you see towards enforcing some sort of regulation or policy that can address not only those more visible platforms, but also the ones that are least visible and less scrutinized more broadly?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, based on the 2 previous questions and yours, the unseen part here are, for instance, not even just fringe platforms, but like encrypted messaging applications. Telegram is a very popular place. This happens on Discord. This happens in a lot of other places that are just not these surface level communities. And we cannot really, say much about those because we didn't really investigate those, and they're really hard to track down. As of now, all of this is living, on the regular internet in pretty big communities. So at least right now, we haven't even gotten, I think, to the stage to care too much about what happens, or of course this is happening on Telegram, and of course this is happening in other places, but right now it's all still pretty surface level. I think down the road, once we have meaningful enforcement on these big communities, we'll see this potential migration to darker and harder to access places. We haven't even touched on Tor and hidden services, right, where this could definitely relocate. So I think we will have to worry, as we usually have to worry about these type of things, of going into harder and harder places to study. But I think at this stage, we are not even there yet. I think we have to figure out enforcement on these huge communities that are on the surface web before we can even worry about that. I saw Yael and I saw I think Mihir.
Yeah, I'm curious about the control methodology, because, right, so if it actually is that, right, whatever, like the policy effect ends up affecting the control as well, right, either because it draws people to like other sorts of sexual content or just like drawing more people to the platform in general, it seems like that's not something that you would be able to see from this sort of measurement.
So you're saying that if the policy leads people to other subforums, for example?
For example, or draws them away for some reason, right? But if there is an effect on what we think is the control due to the policy.
Yeah, I think so. We would be able to see. So if there was a meaningful amount of new activity on the other subforums, we would see that the synthetic control would more so match the trajectory of the treated. But because there's such a big gap, we can more clearly isolate that the effect was specifically on that subform rather than activity throughout all the other subforms. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. I guess I'm just curious about like, right, in terms of like what conclusions you can draw. Because, for example, actually, if it's drawing more activity to the platform as a whole, that's actually meaningful also, even though it's not just to that subforum specifically.
Yeah, so I think what we can see is that the platform continues to grow, like purely observational, we can see that the platform grows. But what this method lets you isolate is that that specific subforum grew significantly faster than the other subforums, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
During the same period of time.
So I think that, like, to her point is that if this happened, it would mitigate the effect, right? So if the whole platform grew, the effect we're estimating would be smaller than the true effect because the control has some effect, right?
And that's something you wouldn't be able to tell, right?
You wouldn't be
was
able
it
to
just
tell,
all
but
growing,
you could argue that,
or
like,
was it growing due to this?
Yeah, but then you could argue that, like, it grew quicker than the other thing that had an effect, right?
Yeah.
So it's even bigger, right? I think the problem would be if if this negatively impacted the controls, and that the gap you see is because it's drew away people from the other categories.
Towards that, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mihir.
Great talk. What did you, I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense of the market structure of what these forms are, because it sounds like people are substituting, right, or moving toward these other website A and B. And this question of sort of how many other websites are in that category. When you saw the shutdown of 4chan, do you see increases on website A and B during the time it was shut down? So that it is that people are genuinely substituting between these markets?
The shutdown of 4chan for the other...
Yeah.
We didn't hone in or go in specifically during that time period. I could take a look at the graphs purely at this stage, right? I don't think that might have been the case, just because in 4chan, it's a bit different. Like website A and website B, we're talking a little bit about dissemination and people sharing this type of content. 4chan in this case was really a requests place, so people coming and requesting content. So If anything, we would see maybe some impact of their requests on these other websites, but these other websites were primarily for sharing. That's probably why 4chan going down, doesn't necessarily have like a huge spike on these two websites in the meantime, and also because perhaps people didn't feel the need to, in retrospect, we know that the hack took 2 weeks to recover from, but in the middle of it, I remember, people thought that 4chan would be down for like a day or two, and so, there wasn't necessarily this need to migrate yet because it was not like 4chan is gone, I need to find a new place, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Miranda.
Thanks for the talk, super interesting. I was wondering about the synthetic control method and whether it can account for time, because I noticed that it looked like your time period was like 1 year, and that the increase seemed to go over the summer. This is a complete hypothesis, but given that we know that students are driving a lot of the interest in SNCEI, I was wondering if this could be like students who are just off of school and able to use these tools more. That's like complete hypothesis. Students have been using this for many years, so curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, great question. Well, your question is broadly just also like, are there any other, external factors that could cause and explain what we see here, which is a very valid question. And this is essentially an open threat to any sort of synthetic control methodology. There's all these other things, even with the UK's OSA, we see that this could have, could explain some part of the behavior that we observe. Now, what lends credibility to this is that, if you assume that, right, like that the pre-period is meaningful and predictive of the future behavior, right, like that the behavior that we saw from October 2024 to May 2025 resembles what would happen during the summer, then that lends credibility to this. But to your point, could this have been a summer or a seasonal effect? You would have to rerun this, perhaps with a different window or something like that. I could now extend it throughout the summer and see if something changes. But in general, we do a lot of things to gain credence on the fact that this works and is meaningful and that the effect is indeed there through these placebo tests and so on. But you're right that ultimately there could be some other latent explanation. Marianne, then Bogdan, and then you, I don't know your name.
Yes. Thank you for the talk. This is wonderful. I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit more philosophically about like what you take away from this in terms of like, do you think this means no matter what policy gets implemented, people will just redistribute to shadier and shadier parts of the internet, and so there's no point in implementing policies? Are there things that you can see working better? Are there other ways to measure impacts? What is your takeaway?
I used to be of the school of thought that, yeah, no matter what you did, like things wouldn't change, because I used to study drug sales on the internet, and that just seemed like a hopeless problem. But these days, I do think that making it harder and adding friction, people and the conversations that I've had with other people have swayed me that this friction is indeed important. And I think what we didn't see in 2025, in none of these forums and none of the posts and threads that I read, people were worried about this law, and there was no meaningful enforcement of it. And so I think because there aren't these things, like people are just not feeling the heat. And perhaps if there was more heat, there would be more of an incentive to go to darker and darker places. But right now, just there isn't. And I think that's why, everybody is kind of like alive and well. But I do think, philosophically, adding this friction seems, even though it won't fix the problem, seems like a meaningful thing to do. Yeah. Often.
Yeah, actually my question is similar to the previous one. It's like US criminalized digital piracy, not pornography. It's like 1997, like No Theft Act, blah, blah. And it hasn't sort of piracy like at all. Because basically you just like search in Yandex and like Russians websites, well, like gaming piracy is very popular, etc. So I'm not sure how like this act even supposed to influence people outside of the US. because like it's kind of impossible. If it's like just providers, like website providers, you can't stop them, you can't block them because you can use VPNs, and it's not really even a friction. It's just like it's very easy in a sense. So it's like how it's supposed to even like influence people outside of the US.
Yeah, so I mean, this as a teenager who was very keenly aware of torrents and coming from the country where I came from, which is a hub of piracy, I would definitely resonate with what you said. Yet here in 2026, I pay for Netflix and HBO and a host of other things, even though I know exactly where I could get all these things, right? And so I think even though the story of like digital piracy feels like there wasn't meaningful gains there, I think overall we did find that people, pay for Spotify and pay for Netflix. And so a meaningful amount of people, I think, ended up going to these platforms where they were comfortable with because the friction became too much. And all of a sudden you felt a little bit dodgy, with the Pirate Bay, and you felt like you were gonna get malware or whatever. And so I think this friction did indeed have some mitigating effects on the amount of piracy over time. That would be just my gut feeling. And so again, today sitting here now, it does feel like this friction may impede a good amount of people, especially the people that we see on 4chan who are just going there and asking, hey, can you take the clothes off of this person? If this wasn't so easy, it doesn't mean that it will go away, but perhaps it would be harder and you wouldn't have thousands and thousands of posts of people asking for this. Yes, you.
Did you consider at all the other reasons people might be going to these sites, especially in recent months? Like, did you look at Google search trends of like the trend for deepfakes has gone up, and then also something I was thinking of when listening to this talk was it's been in the news a lot in recent months about deepfakes, especially because of this legislation.
Mm-hmm.
It is like a paradoxical effect of because this legislation was passed, you have news media reporting on deepfakes, and then people are like, oh, I'm going to go Google this.
I thought that, and I really wanted to find that, but unfortunately, the trends, stays relatively stable. But I was like, man, that would be a killer story. Like all this news coverage, drew attention to this, and I kind of wanted it to be true, but so far we haven't found evidence for that. I do get a sense that, for instance, the Taylor Swift incident did make a lot of people more aware of these things and spark curiosity. But with the stuff that we have here, we don't have enough evidence to say much to the effect. And with Google Trends data alone, we also don't have enough to say anything to that.
Do you have any thoughts on, I think recently it made a bunch of waves that essentially you can just use Grok for a lot of these things, not exactly like pornography, but I guess something that is like closely adjacent to it, I would say, by just saying at Grok, just undress this person or something like that, like blatantly obvious in social media, right? Not even in like specific forums or whatnot. Like, are there any, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, has there been some discussion in the relevant communities about this, or not necessarily?
Absolutely. The people are loving Grok for these communities, as you would expect. I think there is a separate study to be done in how these technological developments or the lack of safety, what's the impact on this ecosystem. And I can think of at least a few tools that seem to have a very meaningful effect in the production of deepfake pornography. Not in this study, but I think there is a study to be done there, and I'm pretty sure that there are some tools that have caused a spike of interest and attention and production on this type of content.
Yeah, I guess similar to the kind of point that was made earlier regarding there's a lot more media attention potentially on this entire problem, so it could be that people that previously, I don't know, maybe it's less likely of an explanation rather than just saying, well, one site shut down, a lot of traffic migrated in some way, shape, or form. That seems more likely, but it could be that the increased attention is sort of like putting this onto people's radar in the first place, and all of these, I don't know, again, like Elon, just being Elon, just like putting out all this stuff,
I think there is something there, yeah, I agree.
Cool, let's thank the speaker once again.